Prior to the discovery of the Egyptian Gnostic Library found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, our greatest resource for the understanding of Gnosticism were the works of the 2nd century writer Irenaeus. The problem, of course, was that Irenaeus was a theological pugilist dedicated to the very destruction of Gnosticism. Thus, for the orthodoxy, Irenaeus became a militant saint, decisively responsible for the triumph of Catholicism and the eventual defeat of the Gnostic religion, or the Gnostic variant of Christianity. So much so that Irenaeus was declared a doctor of the church, probably the highest honor one can receive in the Catholic world, just earlier this year in 2022, making him the most ancient Christian to receive that honor, thus positioning Irenaeus alongside theological titans of orthodoxy like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. For those more inspired by Gnostic or otherwise esoteric or occult spirituality, Irenaeus, on the other hand, has come to symbolize the brash theological power grab of the Catholic Church and its dedication to brutally suppressing anything the ecclesiastical authorities deemed to be heresy, thus rendering Irenaeus as a kind of proto-inquisitor, ruthlessly stamping out all dissent, especially the spiritual dissent of Gnosticism and similar alternative historical spiritualities. The problem with this position is that neither of these actually capture the complexity and ingenuity of Irenaeus and his anti-Gnostic writings. He goes equally unread by Orthodox admirers. He's a sainted doctor of the church now, who's completely beyond reproach, so why read him? As by his Gnostic modern informed detractors, why study a text which is inherently unreliable because of its polemical nature, especially when we can just go read actual Gnostic texts which are currently available. In this episode, I want to explore Irenaeus neither as a saint nor as an inquisitor, but as an important figure in the development of Christian philosophy and spirituality, both Gnostic and Orthodox. If you're interested in Gnosticism, Hermetic philosophy, or the academic study of magic, or the history of the cult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support work like this, accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, or perhaps consider a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find those links below, and your support of this channel makes long-form content like this possible. I really appreciate your consider supporting the channel. Now, let's turn to Irenaeus and his much heralded, and I imagine, around these parts at least, much derided on the detection and overthrow of the falsely called Gnosis, better known simply as Against the Heresies. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. It is profoundly difficult to downplay just how significant the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era were for the development of Christianity and, by extension, the history of Western civilization and thus the world more generally. There are literally billions of Christians out there somewhere. The Roman execution of Jesus of Nazareth and the rise of the Jesus movement in its transition to institutional Christianity, or better, Christianities, would be marked by enormous intellectual conflict internally and conflicts from the outside upon Christianity. The reason, in a way, is rather simple. While the Christian field held that the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus as central for the process of human and cosmic redemption, just what that meant in the details was anything other than worked out by the end of the first century. And by the second century, those details could find spiritual, ritual, and theological homes in almost polar opposite camps. One finds the Jewish Christians, the Ebionites, holding fast to the Mosaic law and focusing on the very human Jesus adopted by God for the spiritual redemption of humankind. On the other hand, we find the followers of Marcion, who accepted a form of bitheism, rejecting the cruel, jealous God of the Hebrew Scriptures in favor of the God of love expressed in the Gospels and the writings of Paul. Marcionism still kind of survives, and I bet you've heard an argument like that at some point in your life. Both the Ebionites and the Marcionites deeply believed they were the true inheritors of the gospel of Christ, despite holding nearly mutually exclusive beliefs at almost every register. Thus was the intensely diverse, we might even say divisive, Christian field of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Of course, into this Christian field, we must add the similarly non-aligned groups that we now call the proto-orthodoxy, represented by figures like Justin Martyr and star of this episode, Irenaeus, and the Gnostics, represented by figures like Valentinus. Now, I've already made an entire long-form episode about Valentinus and his form of Gnostic Christianity. In fact, I've actually argued that despite his eventual condemnation by the proto-orthodoxy, he was likely the first true systematic theologian in all of Christian history, and his church actually lasted for centuries, at least out east. If you don't have much of an understanding of Valentinus and his Gnostic theology, you may want to pause this episode here, and then check out my episode on Valentinian Gnosticism in the card above before proceeding, because this episode may be a bit confusing without it. In fact, it is primarily Valentinian Gnosticism that Irenaeus sets his sights upon in his major polemic. Irenaeus the Peacemaker was born in Smyrna near modern-day Izmir in Asia Minor around 130 of the Common Era into a Christian family, which was kind of relatively rare that early on in the history of Christianity. Most people were converts. As a youth, he learned from the teachings of Polycarp, who in turn had been instructed by none less than John the Evangelist, like John the Evangelist that actually knew Jesus of Nazareth. This apostolic succession business of authoritative teaching will make a strong impression on Irenaeus, and it's going to be really important, so just hold on to it. Though, just for the scorecard, Valentinus could make a similar claim, though via Theudas to St. Paul. Eventually, Polycarp would be martyred. He was actually stabbed to death when his body refused to catch fire after that natural 20 saving throw against fire, but a natural 1 against being stabbed. Irenaeus himself would relocate to Lugundum in Gaul, modern Lyon in France. Around the persecution of Christians in the region under Marcus Aurelius, yep, good guy stoic hunk Marcus had no love for the Christians, Irenaeus was actually sent to Rome to meet with the then Pope Eleutherius to deal with, among other things, the rise of Montanism. Montanism was an early Christian movement marked by ecstatic prophecy, and this guy and his 2 prophetic women, this is a topic for another day, y'all. At some point during the Aurelian persecution, Pothinus, who was the bishop of Lugdunum, was actually martyred, and upon his return from Rome, Irenaeus took his place, which is a kind of ominous thing when your boss gets martyred and you... At any rate, it was during this time that he composed the works that cemented his position in Christian history, especially his on the detection and overthrow of the falsely-called Gnosis, usually just called Against the Heresies, sometime between 175 and 190 of the Common Era. Not much is known of his life during his tenure as bishop, though we are later told by Eusebius that he did in fact intervened to urge Pope Victor I not to excommunicate all those Christians over there in Asia who actually dated and celebrated Easter in connection with the Jewish holiday of Passover. This is a tradition that it seemed like also his teacher Polycarp also accepted. When and how he died isn't clear, but I always imagine Christians at this time dying in some elaborate Rube Goldberg martyrdom scenario, so I'm going to go with being burned alive after being drowned in a well for a year. I have no idea how he actually died. You can make up your own story if you like. A few things about his life are worth mentioning before moving on to his central work. The first is that even within Orthodox Christianity, there was a large amount of disagreement, even on central things like, when to celebrate Easter. I just mentioned that. They still haven't figured out when to celebrate Easter. Just the day that Jesus was resurrected and metaphysically redeemed all things. Disagreements on things like that. Secondly, other non-proto-orthodox Christianities were thriving. Clearly, Montanism was doing well in Rome, and it appears that Irenaeus had direct contact with Valentinian Christianity there as well. In fact, Valentinus nearly became the bishop of Rome, which wasn't that big a deal in the 2nd century, but whatever. In fact, we're even told that one of his classmates, Irenaeus' classmates under Polycarp, actually adopted the Valentinian position, which prompted Irenaeus to realize how much of a threat it was, thus inspiring his polemic against Valentinian Gnosticism. Third, painting Irenaeus as a kind of proto-inquisitor actually using political power or even physical violence to suppress other Christianities is just flatly anachronistic. All of these Christians, Jewish Christians like the Ebionites, Gnostics like Valentinus, or proto-Orthodox people like Irenaeus, were living in a fundamentally pagan world with less than 10%, probably only 5 to 6% of the empire, even Christian at all by this point. Even during as tolerant and wise an emperor as Marcus Aurelius, violent suppressions did occur, though these were likely exaggerated in severity by later generations. When your slogan is, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, you kind of gotta crank up that blood. Irenaeus was much, much more likely to have been persecuted than to actually have persecuted anyone himself. I'm sure to all the local pagans, all these various Christians were just flavors of those weirdos, just as much as 12th century Christians really appreciated the difference between Sunnis and Shias, especially all those different kind of number Shia. To my knowledge, the only weapons Christians really wielded against each other at this time period in history were sarcastic books beefing about how everyone else is wrong, but me and the cool kids I run with. The Christian Taliban-like lynch mobs that killed Hypatia, for instance, were still a century or so off, but they were coming. But, and this is the last point I'll make before turning to Irenaeus specifically, the proto-orthodoxy were developing a kind of secret weapon in all this. The concept of heresy. The term Heresies just means choice, or perhaps better, opinion, and which usually connected with the philosophical choice one made when settling upon a school of belief. Your Heresies might be Stoicism, or Christianity, or Judaism, or Gnosticism. Generally speaking, the word didn't really have a negative connotation and generally wasn't the term used for incorrect belief in the early Jesus movement. In the New Testament, they actually prefer terms like false teachers or false teaching. Despite many texts in the New Testament already dealing with internal, doctrinal, organizational, and ritual disagreements, Christians really had a lot to get done. Rather, it seems that the terms heresy and heretic really emerge in the proto-Orthodox circles that saw themselves as the true bearers of apostolic authority. Specifically here, it seems that Justin Martyr really pioneered the term as a kind of catch-all, first against Jews who rejected Christianity, as in his dialogue with Trypho, who may have been actually related to the rabbinical Tarfon, but By extension, incorrect beliefs outside of what he felt were the correct teachings of the generation just before Irenaeus in the apostolic succession. In fact, in his now lost Syntagma, or book against all heresies, which everyone seemed to write from Justin Martyr to Hippolytus, this is the first time this term is probably systematically used, with heresy and heretic being adopted by the church in wider parlance. By developing a fully orthodox us versus a heretical them logic, Justin Martyr would certainly set the stage for Irenaeus in his attack on Gnosticism and really any deviation from orthodoxy that would develop in the entire history of Catholicism. It's in all this context that Irenaeus pins on the detection and overthrow of the falsely-called Gnosis, or just against the heresies. Originally in Greek, the work primarily survives, although in a relatively word-for-word, poor Latin translation, which is even more the pity because Irenaeus wasn't that great a writer to begin with, and he admits as much. That it was being written in Greek despite his being bishop in Latin Gaul shouldn't be too surprising. Greek was still the intellectual language of the day, and Western Latin Christianity is actually more the product of North Africa than it was of Europe. Remember that Augustine, the real founder of Latin Christianity, is from Hippo. The work would prove enormously popular, even being translated as far afield as Syria and Armenia, and manuscript fragments in Greek have been recovered as well at Oxyrhynchus and the wonderful trash pile there in Egypt. In short, it is a 5-volume attack on what we would now call Gnosticism, specifically on the Valentinian variant of Christianity, though Irenaeus actually causes a pretty wide net. He also targeted an otherwise little-known Gnostic variant headed by a fellow named Marcus Magus, or Marcus the Magician as he styles him, whose letter and number mysticism represent a kind of gematria-like precursor to speculations found in the Kabbalah and other occult systems, and Christians would actually use it too and not give him any credit. Further, he would also target Carpocratians, Basilidians, Ebionites, Saturnians, Cerinthians, Nicolaitans, those pesky Sardonians, our Marcionites we mentioned earlier, Borborians, Sethians, who are really popular now but not so much in the book, Ophites, and Canaanites, who actually used a Gospel of Judas, fragments of which were only recently discovered. And that's only in the first volume, folks. I'm not kidding. This thing is truly encyclopedic in scope. It's an encyclopedia of theological beef. So let's talk about the structure of the work itself. The first volume, as I just mentioned, details at absolutely painstaking length and detail the cosmogenic speculations of the Gnostics, with a special focus on the Valentinian system. Now, unless you're a real Gnostic nerd, hashtag Gnostic nerd of the highest degree, these sections just read like lists of Greek words begetting other Greek words with Ogdoads and Enneads, Sophias, Ennoias, Epinoias, Norias, and of course, demiurges, as far as the eye can see. The first book can really be a slog, but just as there are people out there who prefer the Silmarillion to the Lord of the Rings, these sections are very important for grasping the cosmologies of the ancient Gnostics and are truly worth reading. Kinda, maybe, probably. For my Gnostic adjacent folks out there, and if you're watching this channel, you're probably much more likely to be on Team Gnostics than on Team Proto-Orthodoxy. I see you. I see you. I have a feeling that I know the question and concerns that are on your mind at this moment. It might be the reason why you've never bothered to even read Irenaeus at all. Why should we trust his account of Gnosticism if he was explicitly hostile to it? Well, there's obviously some ground here for suspicion, but there are several reasons to actually take him seriously, and I'd like to go through those. The first is that it's very clear that he has both read ancient Gnostic works and actively sought out to communicate with Gnostic leaders to learn about their faith. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't mock them on basically every page, and that every page isn't actually dripping with real sarcasm. Though, I have to admit, those little bits are like humor oases in this text for people who don't have a dog in this fight. And I ain't got a dog in the fight between the Gnostics and the proto-orthodoxy. He's honestly pretty funny at times, and some of the shade thrown it's some of the finest in 2nd century Gaul, folks. Secondly, Irenaeus has a self-interested motivation to get all the things he writes about in the first book correct. Why? Because the first book functions as a kind of exposé. That is, Irenaeus is trying to show how the Gnostic systems are wrong by simply describing them in extreme detail, revealing how, at least to his mind, they are just a bunch of made-up, overcomplicated nonsense. He thinks that just by telling people the truth about all those aeons and ogdoads and syzygies and demiurges and sophias and epinoias and ennoias, that any reasonable person will just go, well, that's all just fucking crazy. I'm not believing that. Of course, he believes that, a zombie rabbi fixed evil brought about by a talking snake and a rib woman and clay man via an act of cosmic child abuse. Also, I'm supposed to believe that a dude went up on a mountain to get rules from a sky man to get agricultural lands and children. And I even have friends that believe things like if you just sit down, you can end suffering if you sit quietly enough, but sometimes you have to repeat things in Sanskrit over and over. You can see the problem. The problem with the religious expose method is that it's the nuclear option when it comes to polemicizing against other religions. It's almost always mutually assured destruction. It's damn funny though. Of course, this method is still widely in use. It's recently been used in pop culture, I think on South Park, against the Church of Latter-day Saints and against the Scientology movement. Of course, at the heart of this is the basic logical fallacy that someone else's religion appearing unreasonable somehow makes yours more so. Regardless, it's actually Irenaeus' commitment to the method of the exposé that actually drives him to want to describe his opponent's position with some degree, in fact, I would say a relatively high degree of accuracy. If you don't describe their positions accurately, they'll just say, we don't really believe that, and the entire work fails. Now, since 1945, we can actually check his descriptions against actual Gnostic text, including one that he actually mentions, the Valentinian Gospel of Truth. Turns out, he was actually pretty accurate, and even gaps in the Gnostic text that we have now can even be filled with a little bit of comparative work with Irenaeus that I'm sure is causing him to roll in his grave, using Irenaeus to fix Gnostic texts so we can understand Gnosticism better. That grave, by the way, was maybe ransacked by Huguenots in the 16th century, so fun fact there, grave desecration. So all in all, Irenaeus is relatively reliable when it compared to other Gnostic texts. Further, those other texts are often meant really only for those initiated into the inner circles of the Gnostic world, and may have even functioned more as an aid for memory than a book you would read to learn about the Gnostic cosmology, for instance. Because the audience of Irenaeus' against the heresies is a bit broader, his presentation could actually prove clearer, strangely enough, than those of actual Gnostic text found at Nag Hammadi or in the Askew or Bruce codices, respectively. I mean, the Pistis Sophia makes the Gospel of Truth or the Apocryphon of John look like IKEA Billy bookcase instructions in terms of simplicity when it comes to complex Gnostic cosmologies. Regardless, if you're a fan of Gnostic cosmology and snarky proto-orthodox humor, Book 1 will prove to be your jam. If not, Godspeed and good luck. Oh yeah, that was just Book 1. We got like 4 more to... Hi. Book 2 is for my philosophers out there, especially those interested in logic and the state of philosophy in the 2nd century, given its pre-Neoplatonism. pre-Neoplatonism doesn't sound the least bit pretentious, but here's a little bit more pretension: the hegemony of Middle Platonism and Stoicism. Here, Irenaeus presses the Gnostics along primarily logical and metaphysical lines. He's criticizing them on these lines using Aristotle's dialectic. He's going to say, internally, these systems don't make any sense. Something he actually acknowledges that the Gnostics themselves are actually rather more adept at than he is. And he says, I'm rather skeptical of logic to begin with, which is a weird thing to be skeptical of. Generally speaking, we might call the mode of attack here a combination of immanent and transcendent criticism, though more of the former than the later. That is to say that Irenaeus is keen to show that the internal logic of the various Gnostic cosmologies are themselves faulty. Specifically, the logical deductions of the various aeons and the complex syzygies or pairs are simply incoherent on strictly philosophical, strictly logical grounds. A classical example he points out, and there are many of these, is that according to many Gnostic myths, in her ignorance, the aeon Sophia, or wisdom, overreached to create on her own, thus producing the hideous Lovecraftian demiurge Yaldabaoth. But what logical sense does it make to say that wisdom was so fundamentally ignorant? Well, none. None. Irenaeus argues none. It's nonsense from a purely logical perspective. Wisdom can't be ignorant, regardless of whatever myth is supposed to be communicating in the first place. Irenaeus points out dozens of these seeming logical fallacies, and especially in his sights are the concepts of divine plurality, all those various aeons and their internal logical relationships. Of course, he also constantly jokes about the irony that people claiming to be Gnostics or knowers don't seem to know logic very well, even though Irenaeus claims that even he, a non-philosopher, can detect such errors. Though it's possible, maybe even likely, that he's just missing the point of the Gnostics in that they didn't actually take these myths to be literal, logical, metaphysical progressions in the way that he does. Just as many Christians don't take the Genesis creation myth, really myths, there are at least two of them there, and there's another one in Psalms. There are at least a few in the Bible. They don't take the stories word per word literally. Like, what does it mean for there to be days before the sun and the whatever? It seems likely that neither did these ancient Gnostics take these elaborate myths logically, literally either. This whole who gets to decide what's literal and what's figurative in Scripture is going to matter a ton in just a minute. We'll come back to that here soon. I should also point out that this won't be the last purely philosophical assault on Gnosticism either. Another would appear from pagan corners. Yes, there were pagan attacks on Gnosticism, a century later led by none other than Plotinus, the founder of what we now call Neoplatonism. That's a tale for another day. Yes, I will certainly circle back to Plotinus's criticisms of Gnosticism. While Irenaeus is at pains to show that what he takes to be logical failures of the Gnostic systems, he's quick to point out that Christianity isn't about logic really at all. It's about faith. Faith specifically in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ as the process of redemption itself. So, admitting the limitations of logic, the rest of Irenaeus' book is actually about establishing that faith, or pistis, not knowledge or gnosis, is what truly matters, especially putting one's faith in the correct doctrines as vouchsafed by the correct line of trustworthy succession via the apostles. Now, books 3, 4, and 5 are probably going to be the least interesting for all my pro-Gnostic folks out there, but are utterly decisive for my orthodox, Gnostic nerds versus orthodox. In fact, it's without a doubt that these sections are what earned Irenaeus the title of Doctor of the Church, because they were nearly taken up wholesale into Catholic orthodoxy, with a strange, really strange exception about Jesus' lifespan that I'll come back to in a minute. In Book 3, Irenaeus attacks the Gnostic systems mostly by using this newfangled thing called Scripture. As you probably know, the development of the Christian canon, or the authoritative scriptures, which became the New Testament as we know it, was by no means hammered out by the 2nd century. I mean, it ain't even hammered out now. Mormons still adding books. In fact, remember Marcion? He was among the earliest to really throw down the canon gauntlet, and folks like Irenaeus are actually building the Orthodox canon of scriptures as a kind of response in many ways to folks like him, and actually to other Gnostics. Irenaeus quotes from what would become scripture constantly. He kind of even just speaks Bible. And virtually every work will become canon he cites, including the Apocalypse of John, which he actually knew was produced just a generation prior to his own birth. So Book 3 is actually a critical moment in the development of what we would now call the New Testament, and its authority for creating doctrine, or at least arguing against the doctrine of others. Irenaeus even provides arguments, weird arguments, but arguments for why there are 4 and only 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these arguments are kind of quasi-mystical about how the number 4 is in all of nature, and there can only be 4 Gospels. You can read it yourself. Further, and just as importantly, he argues that apostolic succession, the direct teachings of the Gospels from Jesus to the apostles to the later generations, actually vouchsafes both correct doctrine, but in many ways even just as important, and maybe more importantly, correct hermeneutics by which to read those recently named scriptures. Recall, Jesus taught John, who taught Polycarp, who taught our friend, or maybe your enemy, Irenaeus. Now, by contrast, Irenaeus argues that all of the Gnostics had their origins in the teachings of the anti-Peter character, Simon Magus. Now, Simon Magus is going to get his own episode at some point soon because he's just wonderfully fascinating. But as you probably know, he appears in the New Testament book of Acts as a Samaritan convert of the apostle Philip, who eventually tried to bribe the disciples to get magical powers and is rebuked and told to repent. That's all that happens in the New Testament, basically. In time, however, a whole literature would spring up around him and St. Peter duking it out, preaching, and having this cool harlot companion named Helen, and flying around in the sky and then falling out of the sky, and of course becoming the father of all heresies. You know, fun stuff. For Irenaeus, Simon Magus was a kind of proto-Gnostic who had his own disciples as a kind of anti-church. These Gnostic disciples would go on to develop their own Gnostic systems untethered to any divinely inspired truth, which is, for Irenaeus, precisely why the Gnostic systems varied so widely in their mythological structures. They lacked, according to Irenaeus, a divinely inspired hermeneutic, which allowed them to tell the difference between what was to be taken literally in Scripture and what was simply figurative or metaphorical, and further, what those figures and metaphors actually meant. He even gives a kind of genealogy of heresy emerging from Simon Magus and splitting based on the various disciples of Simon Magus. This section is, I think, the most eminently, completely untrustworthy historical aspect of Irenaeus' work, but it's still super interesting. This was probably at least in part to counter the exact same claims being made to apostolic succession made by Valentinus, remember, who claimed that his teacher was Theudas, who in turn was taught by the Apostle Paul, depending on how much you trust the Apostle Paul. Regardless, Irenaeus uses this argument to show why one should trust his specific scriptures and not the Gnostic ones, his specific hermeneutic of scriptures, and the correct beliefs derived from scripture, including ideas like the physical incarnation of Jesus, the virgin birth, and Jesus' actual suffering on the cross, etc., along with the general transmission of authority from the apostles to the bishops, like himself. Thus, Book 3 is a sustained assault, often a negative image, on Gnostic scriptures, origins, and authority, which goes on to actually lay the foundation for much of what became the Orthodoxy's scriptures, their origin story, and how they claim that they have authority. In this way, Book 3 is positively titanic in terms of its achievement on Irenaeus' part and well worth reading carefully. I would have loved if an ancient or modern Gnostic would have responded to books 3 and 4 especially. And no, from what we can tell, no Gnostic in antiquity responded to Irenaeus at all, though there is actually some evidence of intra-Gnostic beefs from texts recovered at Nag Hammadi, so we know that they did argue with each other about how to be a Gnostic, but sadly it doesn't appear that any of the Gnostics took Irenaeus to task, at least in the writings that have survived. Book 4 is a sustained argument that what Christians call the Old Testament is in fact authoritative scripture, precisely because it predicts the coming of Jesus and his whole salvific agenda. This book is really fascinating because it's kind of a dual attack on the extreme edges of non-proto-orthodox Christianity. Non-orthodox. Ramal, we're thinking here of the Ebionites and the Marcionites. Recall from earlier that they were Jewish Christians that especially disliked Paul, and Christians that rejected the Old Testament as a meanie, and they really only kind of like Paul. So we have the anti-Paul Jewish Christians and the pro-Paul bitheists, the Marcionites. Here, Irenaeus kind of lives up to his name as a peacemaker, but by going through both extremes as a kind of mean. He argues that the Old Testament is scripture because it is part of the salvific plan, which sets the stage and predicts the coming of Jesus' salvific work, a work that does complete and thus abrogates certain elements of Jewish law, especially circumcision, kashrut, or the laws around food and ritual holidays. Thus, there aren't two gods, one bad and one good, as Marcion argued, nor is Jesus a mere man adopted by God for a messiahship with adherence to Jewish law remaining completely intact. Notice here, he's arguing against both Marcion and the Ebionites by arguing that the Old Testament is canon. I find Book 4 especially ingenious in this regard, and it's an interesting example of how the Orthodoxy did, in fact, actually strive to be as Catholic or universal as possible, keeping the majority mean, but excising much on the positional extremes. Speaking of Jesus' redemptive role in history, this is probably the place to mention the strangest idea in Irenaeus' thinking. Now, Christians virtually all agreed that Jesus' death and resurrection meant some kind of salvific or redemptive event had taken place, but Christians couldn't and still don't totally agree on just what that means. There was the ransom model, which is kind of my favorite, the atonement model, the Gnostic revelation model, and Irenaeus' curious recapitulation model, among several others. In this scheme, because Christ had become incarnate, his living through each phase of human life meant that he redeemed it from the injury, the scar of sin. From sweet baby Jesus to full-grown beardo, his very living out of each phase of human life redeemed that element of humanity. But, and this is where it gets weird, Irenaeus seems to have also indicated that Jesus must have also lived through old age as well, which is generally said by Irenaeus to be around 40 to 50 years of age. To redeem that age range, you have to live through it. Thus, this puts Jesus' age at the time of the execution up to 20 years later than traditionally thought. Of course, the historical Jesus probably lived to be about 30 to 33 before he was executed by the Romans, though even the Gospels can't quite agree on how long he preached. The Synoptics seem to indicate that was perhaps even less than a year before he was executed, while the Gospel of John has him preaching for a full 3 years before his execution. Now, there have been some mental gymnastics on the part of the Orthodoxy to make all this make sense, but yeah, this is just a super weird aspect of Irenaeus' overall salvation plan, that Jesus had to be 40, maybe even 50 before being executed. But I kind of like the idea of Jesus just waiting around to get to 40 or 50 so he can finally die, fix everything, then get out of Dodge. The final book, Book 5, is a sustained defense of the literal bodily resurrection of the just and the eternal judgment to heaven and hell, because why not end the book with a promise and a threat? Of course, as you probably all know, many aspects of Gnostic schools was the dismissal of the physical world as evil, the work of the horrible demiurge, Cyclops or Yaldabaoth, or pick a demiurge, any demiurge. Further, many Gnostic schools, like the Valentinians, also held some version of reincarnation. This is a topic that Irenaeus also argued about in Book 2 especially, which also seemed to indicate that all people would eventually achieve salvation. That's a kind of cheery thing about Valentinian Gnosticism. Irenaeus rejects both positions. The physical world, while imperfect, isn't evil precisely because it's a creation of God. Just FYI, Plotinus is going to make a very similar argument, especially about the heavenly bodies not being evil, as they kind of are in many Gnostic theologies. They're the archons, the prison guards of reality. Its imperfection, Irenaeus argues, is because of the sins which human beings brought into the world. You remember the talking snake part. Further, the sufferings of Jesus was real and not a mere appearance. This is against the so-called Docetists. And because physical reality is the work of God, it too will enjoy the redemption. Also, everybody's going to end up in heaven or hell forever. I hope I know where I'm going. You either reject redemption or you reject it and you get paid your dividends. Again, Irenaeus is sailing between extreme positions here. The physical world and our bodies aren't evil, nor is everything just fine the way that it is. The salvific redemption of Christ is still central to the story, including the eventual physical resurrection of the just. And there, without a great sweeping conclusion, this monumental and prolix work and episode, equal parts expose, polemic, philosophical, and theological treatise, comes to a final end, thank God. While famed as an exposition and attack on Gnosticism, Irenaeus' On the Detection and Overthrow of the Falsely-Called Gnosis is so much more. And did we see so much development of what became orthodoxy in the text? What's most profoundly interesting about that development is that it appears to be as a response to and against Gnosticism as much as apostolic traditions inherited by Irenaeus. In this way, we can see the proto-orthodoxy and Gnosticism as locked in a kind of dialectic in the greater field that would become Christianity as we know it, and thus appreciate how they, in turn, actually gave rise to each other. It wasn't so much the orthodoxy against the Gnostics, but the dance produced them both. That is until certain Christianities got state power and heresy transitioned from being a mere sin to becoming a state crime. Yeah, that happened in the 4th century, but that's another tale for another day. So, you want to read Irenaeus. The only complete English translation of Against the Heresies was made well over a century ago, and along with some real anti-Semitic zingers in the notes, it's really uneven in terms of its translation, given that it was the work of several hands and not a lot of work was clearly put into it to polish it off to make it readable. You can find it online and in Book 1 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers series, which is widely used and in reprints. There's also a more modern translation in progress in the Ancient Christian Writers series that I believe has gotten all the way up to Book 3, though it too is a confessional rather than a purely academic translation. Perhaps one of the best introductions to Irenaeus is by Dennis Menz, who's I think also a Dominican monk. You seeing a pattern here? Though, if you've made it this far, you'll know that reading the text, while rewarding, is a slog. Things I do for this channel. Again, if you read it, good luck and Godspeed. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.